Great Female Spiritual Gurus, Part 4, Bernadette Roberts. Hello, this is Shores of Infinity with your host Chris, and this time about Bernadette Roberts, one of the greatest female spiritual gurus of all times, maybe even the one who got farther in the path or on the path of enlightenment than anyone else. But definitely she was up there, at the very borders of human consciousness. And her main message basically is a very unpopular one, that's why she's not so famous, that what we usually term enlightenment is not the end, it's just the beginning. For some reason that is not something that most people want to hear, because there's this mystique of enlightenment, how UG calls it. And she grew up in a Christian context and also had enlightenment experiences very early on, from early childhood, and tried to fit it somehow into her Christian terminology. She also was a nun for a while, but she gave it up. She wanted to have family, and she did. And she tried to live quite a normal life, but at the same time being enlightened and going further and further and further and exploring the shores of infinity. She writes, "Our contemplative maps of the journey come to an end with the discovery of the true self and its oneness with the divine. This unitive state, known by various terms and different traditions, follows the falling away of transcendence of the ego and entails a radical change or transformation of consciousness. Beyond this, however, our maps don't go. But this unitive or transcendental state is not the end of the journey. It may be the end of the ego self, but by no means is it the end of the self, either the true self or the phenomenal self. For this we have to go much further." So unfortunately she tries to explain things in terms of self, different kinds of self. I always find this very confusing and try to avoid these self terms because the mind cannot understand. The mind thinks the ego is the self and that's it. Anything else, I personally prefer other terms like spirit or soul or psychic being or whatever, and not true self or capital self or so. But she did, and she had a very funny way to explain this with circles and discs and holes and so on. You can also find videos about that. And basically one self gets replaced by another until then they start to dissolve from the center outwards. And she also says that these beautiful states that people want to think that enlightenment is, and is to some degree, these feelings of bliss and being one with the divine and so on, even that has to be given up and surrendered to reach the highest heights of consciousness, which pairs very nicely with what Meher Baba and Sri Aurobindo and David Hawkins said. David Hawkins even put names to these states and found places for them in his scale from 1 to 1000. So he talks about these states that Bernadette Roberts also talks about and calls them 800 and 850 and 900 and so on. Also, her terminology reminds me a lot of Meher Baba's map. So she calls it different selves, first ego self, then true self, then phenomenal self, then no self, and then beyond no self. And that's beyond no self. No self you could also call void or nothingness or nirvana also. And then beyond no self is Hawkins scale 1000. Or in Meher Baba terms, the seventh plane or even beyond, the beyond state of God. So because she is and has been Christian and believed in this deeper meaning of Christianity. She uses terms like God and the divine and so on. But of course she doesn't mean a person, not an old man with a white beard sitting in the sky on a cloud. But she talks of Christ consciousness and tells us that it is a very different thing. It is a thing, but it is a different thing than we think it is, and it's also very impersonal. And again, it's not about the person Jesus Christ. It's a certain kind of higher consciousness that you can reach. And why not call it Christ consciousness? Because it has to do, of course, with a part of you dying and a new part emerging, like a rebirth. So for people who grew up in a Christian context, her books could be very helpful. Her two main books are The Real Christ and What is Self. For those who never had much to do with Christianity or who have a big revulsion against Christianity, her books may be not so helpful. Just because of the terminology. Content-wise, it's fine. Another really interesting thing that she describes, that very few people describe, but it is described, for example by C.G. Jung or Jed McKenna, is if you have been in a very high state of consciousness and then you come back to the normal gross world, the normal sensory experience, that can be really awful. And it is also very likely, because it's very, very hard to maintain these very high states of consciousness. So you spend there some time and then you come back to a lower state of consciousness. And that can be really, heaven and hell. She writes here in her book, What is Self, having to leave the divine condition and come back to the sensory or unsurrected state can only be described as god-awful. It is an inhuman predicament and even inhuman feat. This is more, however, than just a return to a previous state. It is a waking up to a sensory terrain and human condition that, compared to the divine condition, could only be described as hell. It was not even a living hell, because none of it was seen as true life. In contrast to the divine, the human condition is so terrible and devastating that even the worst of descriptions could never do it justice. I am not referring here to sin, evil, or suffering, but rather to bare human existence itself, and the whole natural world included. What we usually think is so beautiful in this world is actually monstrous and unbearable to look at, but only in contrast to the divine. So as you can see here, her writing is very dense. It's actually none of her books is something that you can read in a weekend or in a week. 1 or 2 pages at a time are usually enough and gives you a lot to contemplate about. Also, like Sri Aurobindo, she's so far ahead that sometimes it's very difficult to grasp what she's talking about. But sometimes she's the only one who describes this in detail. There are some, Jed sometimes, Sri Aurobindo sometimes in his convoluted way, David Hawkins sometimes, but this is very clear and very advanced stuff. And when I look at the mother and Bernadette Roberts, two female gurus who really went up high, you see that in the farthest reaches of consciousness, there's no difference anymore. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. It's all the same. What is really refreshing about Bernadette Roberts is that she does not embellish things so much. She's very down to earth, very neutral and sober. Sobriety is always a good sign for spiritual teachers. So she writes here, for example, the only thing I can say, however, is that everything I know of Christ is solely through living experience. It did not come by way of intellectual belief, concepts, symbols, or passing insights. Although it was very prolonged and very difficult, it was all within ordinary daily living and not due to any extraordinary circumstance, opportunity, or position in life. What was extraordinary was not the person or the life, but the grace. It more than stretched the human limits. But what was this journey all about? Well, I have only one view of it, the only view I can really have. It was the gradual revelation of the truth of Christ. The revelation of God, the divine or absolute, never provided the challenge or mystery that kept the journey going. If my only concern had been the experience of the absolute, the journey could have been over before it had begun. But Christ is a further revelation of the absolute, a revelation that challenges us to penetrate not only the nature of the absolute, but our human nature as well. So for her, the highest heights of consciousness, where you have to really surrender everything, even the experience of the divine. She calls that Christ consciousness. And unfortunately, in this green, yellow, hippie, new age circles of the spiritual marketplace, there's a lot of talk about Christ consciousness. And every idiot and their mother's neighbor seems to have access to it. But that's not what she's talking about. Because she's been growing up in a Christian context, she's using Christian terminology, as I've said, and she names this beyond state, this highest state of consciousness, the Christ consciousness or Christ state, because it has something to do with dying and resurrection and going beyond the furthest borders of what you can possibly imagine. And also, of course, across the borders of personality. It has nothing to do with the person anymore. If anything ever reaches this Christ consciousness, it's not a person. It's just an experience, without any experiencer. So to sum it up, if you really want to go deep into stuff, then Bernadette Roberts is your girl. She's really very special and knows from her own experience what she's talking about. It's not an intellectual feat. But on the other hand, also you have to be okay with that Christian terminology. Okay, this is the end of part 4 of the Great Female Spiritual Leaders. Thank you to all my patrons. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Thank you for joining me as a patron. And see you soon.